Amelia Gully today, coming all the way from York, Northern England, to talk to us about the forensic speech recognition, forensic speech analysis. It's going to be really interesting. I know Amelia quite well. We both were studying our PhDs in York around the same time. Amelia is now a lecturer at the University of York in Acoustics. So I don't think I've got anything else to say, but let's put our hands together and cheers.
First of all, I better check that my microphone's on. Yes, okay, I thought I was going to forget to unmute it, so that's already a good start. So hi, everybody, thank you for coming. It's nice to see so many faces in the room. I'm going to talk to you today a bit about a sort of general introduction to acoustics of the human voice, which I think some of you will know a little bit about. I'm going to focus very much particularly on how different it can be from person to person. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of forensic speaker recognition. Now, my day job is as a lecturer in the group of forensic speech science at York, and my other day job is as a senior research scientist at Oxford Wave, which is an audio forensics company. So there is a heavy forensics bent to this. And Tom told me that some of you in the room are at the stage where you're worrying about jobs. So I just wanted to introduce the sort of the field of audio forensics as an option that you might not have thought of. There aren't a million jobs in audio forensics, but there are more than none. So do, and you'll be very well equipped with sort of audio and music tech acoustics knowledge. So there we go. So my aim today is not to go too deeply into anything, but I'm very happy to discuss everything afterwards. The human voice, what is that? I am going to talk today sort of in general about what's involved in speech production. And then I'm going to cover a little bit my work on differences between individuals' vocal tract shapes and how we sort of get that information, how we quantify it. That's all kind of quite embryonic work at the moment, so I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of that. I'll talk briefly about the whole field of audio, forensic audio analysis. And then I'll sort of dive a little bit deeper into forensic speaker recognition, what it is, what the current challenges are, things like that. So yeah, let's get cracking. So the vocal tract, which I will be talking about, and the vocal folds, which I will be talking about, can be seen here on this diagram. Is there like a pointer, or should I be pointing at what's the best arrangement? I'm just thinking for lecture capture purposes, sometimes people like a one on the screen, but...
I can't see one.
Okay, not to worry, I'm going to point at the TV. So yeah, this is basically a mid-sagittal cut through the head, and what we've got basically, when we're talking about the vocal tract, we're talking about everything from the vocal folds up. This is the tongue in the middle here, and we've got the lips over here. The nasal cavity is also a big sort of side branch, but this is essentially a tube with a buzzer at one end, being the vocal folds. So, being essentially a tube with a buzzer at one end, it behaves kind of as you might expect. Acoustically, we have, this is a slightly simplified model, but actually it's good enough for a lot of voice acoustic stuff. It works very well. What we call the source filter model. So basically, we have our vocal folds that are producing a broadband source. When the vocal folds are vibrating together, they produce something a bit like a pulse train. So it's quite broadband. Or if we have noise, so if you're going like, it's kind of closer to a white noise signal. So you've got something broadband, and then that essentially passes through a cascade of bandpass filters, essentially. This is essentially a subtractive synthesizer, if you want to think of it that way. So we have a broadband source, we have a filter with a bunch of different resonances, and we change those resonances by changing the shape of our vocal tract. And what you get out at the other end is the speech signal. So yeah, it's pretty much a straightforward sort of convolution type situation. Looking at the source in a bit more detail, there are two main types. You have the phonation, so that's caused by your vocal folds doing this kind of action many, many times a second. So they give what we call a phonatory sound, and that will have a pitch. And there are other parameters such as spectral slope, harmonics to noise ratio, things like that that can characterize the voice, and which might vary from person to person, as we'll talk about in a bit. And then the alternative, really, the other main type of source is noise, and that's generated when there's a constriction in the vocal tract, and so you get turbulent airflow. So, is an example, but also if the constriction is further up the vocal tract, you have all of those are also just produced by turbulent noise. And then you often can get both together as well. So you might have a sound like zzz, has voicing and a noise source, so then you've got two sources at different points in essentially the tube. The filter, as I said, is you can almost think of it as a stack of bandpass filters, if you like, and it's to do with the resonances of your vocal tract. So depending on the shape of your tract, and if you think about this really simply, you might have a narrow front cavity and a wide back cavity, or vice versa, a wide front cavity and a narrow back cavity. That would give you R and E. Those are the sort of two extremes if we think of it as just two cavities, but of course there's lots of variation on that spectrum, if you like. And it turns out that really the first two of those resonances contain a lot of the information that we need to at least distinguish between vowels. So you can see in this chart over here, these things are the frequency of those resonances. So the F1 is this one, the first what we call formant on this axis, and by convention it's on this axis because that relates to tongue position, as I'll talk about in a minute. And then we have F2 going this way. So basically that's the frequency in hertz of the first and second resonances of the vocal tract. And hopefully you can see on here the vowels are sort of separated within that plane. So with even just those two first two resonances, we can get intelligible vowels. You want more than two really to get them natural sounding. That if you just had a synthesizer and you just put your first two bandpass filters, you'd get something quite robotic sounding. But you would be able to distinguish between the different vowels. The reason we display it with these axes sort of weirdly the wrong way around is that actually this also relates to tongue position. So this axis, this first formant axis, is relating to tongue height. So you can kind of visualize it as if you feel, this is the E vowel, if you kind of feel E, if you make the E sound in your mouth, hopefully you should feel that your tongue is quite high near the roof of your mouth and quite far forward. So it's high and far forward. That's kind of how this diagram is mapping things. And then ooh, your tongue should be high but further back. And then down here we've got something like ah, your tongue is low. So yeah, if you feel it in your mouth, hopefully you can sort of feel how this maps also conveniently to the frequencies of those resonances. And an important point to mention here is that when we're perceiving these vowels, what we're hearing is kind of the ratio between the two. That's what's telling us, oh, that's an R, because you know its first formant is quite high and its second formant sort of in the middle of this range somewhere. Okay, I think that's an R. But the that's the relative ratio of those things to each other. But the absolute values are going to be slightly different depending on the individual, depending on the size of their vocal tract, for instance. So you can imagine just a bigger cavity has a lower resonance, right? So that still holds here. So you can think of these as kind of averages, but what really matters when we're talking about speaker identity is also the absolute values of these types of parameter as well. Also in the filter, if we've got side branches, we'll introduce spectral zeros. So if you can imagine, for instance, if you're making a sound, then actually the airflow is now coming out of your mouth, and there's a side branch it's coming out of your nose, and there's a side branch formed by your mouth, right? So it's sort of ends at the lips, which are closed, and airflow is coming out of the nose. So that is producing a side branch, which is going to introduce a spectral zero. So things like that can be characteristic as well of the size of these different cavities. And the other important point to mention is that speech moves quite rapidly. Our articulators, you know, when we're used to thinking about filters and stationarity, speech is quite fast. Vowel durations tend to be around 100 milliseconds, consonant durations 20 to 50 milliseconds. These are very ballpark figures, and of course they vary a lot from person to person as well. But we assume that it's stationary for around 25 millisecond frames when we're doing processing, just as a general rule. But again, that could vary a little depending on the processing you're doing, but just to think of it as probably we're looking at shorter time windows that you might be looking at with, say, room acoustics or something like that. We're working with what is essentially a very small and fast-moving room. Okay, so that's the source and the filter. And kind of one of the things I really want to get across today is that all of these things are so variable between people. And I think we don't actually really know so much about how much variability there is in the source and the filter, like physically. We know that there's lots of variability in the acoustic signal, and we infer that that means certain things about the anatomy of the vocal tract. But actually we haven't properly made those links for sort of the range of variability that there is. So that's part of what I do. So the type of differences we might see in the source signal are things to do with the size of the larynx. So you can imagine a bigger larynx makes a lower note. How well the vocal folds close together each time. So if they're perfectly closing, you're not going to get any additional sort of noise coming through. But in a lot of cases, people have what we call a breathy voice, which means the vocal folds aren't closing properly each time. And we're getting a bit of that aspiration noise as well. And also if you have different pathologies, that can affect the vocal folds. So for instance, nodules is one of the ones where they just don't close properly because there's a lump of tissue in the way. So that will affect the source signal. And also when we're looking at sort of non-phonation sources, that can be really dependent on anatomy. So for instance, when you make a s sound, you're putting your tongue up against what we call the alveolar ridge, which is a ridge behind your upper teeth. And different people have different shaped alveolar ridges. And as a consequence, their s sounds are all going to be a little bit different. But we're not, we don't have a good map yet of exactly what shape changes in the vocal tract lead to exactly what shape changes in the acoustic signal. We just know that they are a bit different. So we have things like where we suspect that this is a good thing to look at when we're considering vocal tract shape differences. But again, the link hasn't properly been made yet. And then for the filter, hopefully as you can imagine, okay, overall size is going to affect all the resonances, but also different parts of the vocal tract can be different sizes depending on different people's anatomy. And also if you've had some kind of interventions, you can imagine if you've had orthodontics and your hard palate and all your teeth and stuff have squished up and changed, then that is definitely going to affect the resonances of the cavities. But all of this stuff is yet to be explored. And also dynamics, so how all of this stuff is moving, again, that's going to depend on your anatomical constraints. There is also interaction between the source and the filter. It is a pretty good model and it's still used a lot, but it's not completely true to say that the two are independent. So there will be interaction between the two, and what we found recently in our lab is that the degree of interaction is also speaker dependent. All of this stuff, everything's speaker dependent. So the sort of acoustic processes that are taking place are also going to be slightly different depending on each individual. So all of these differences have two sort of main sources, what we call biological and behavioral differences. So basically one's how you are built, and one is where you grew up, sociophonetics, how you learned to use your articulators to convey information. So kind of the point I want to make is that for message identity, we average out a lot of these differences, right? That's the noise. And that sort of often gets focused on in a lot of the speech acoustics literature. In forensics, particularly speaker identity, we want to know about these things. That's where the signal is. So that's kind of where I'm coming at all of this from. So first of all, how do we even get information about the vocal tract? This is 2D real-time MRI. This is a colleague of mine at York. So again, we've got the same sort of slice through the center of the head that you saw in the first diagram. It's facing the other way now, so the lips are here, and the larynx is down here. And if I play this, there's no audio, and the frame rate is a bit weird, so it goes very fast. I apologize. There's 4 frames a second there, but being played back at 25 frames per second. But hopefully you can see just how much movement there is going on. So the tongue movement, this is the soft palate here, opening and closing. One more time, just for luck. So basically everything's moving around a lot, right? That's the point I want to convey with the real-time MRI. And then what we call 3D or volumetric MRI. So this is someone holding a static pose with their vocal tract, but we're taking slices all the way through like a slab of their head. This is the same guy. So hopefully you can see there he had his mouth open. That was an R vowel. And with the 3D, we can extract 3D vocal tract shapes and do numerical acoustic modelling with that kind of thing. So that's one from Peter Burkholtz's Nature paper. So that's not from this same MRI, but that's the kind of shape that we'll get out. And then we can, numerically put a different source signal in here and see what happens, basically. So my research has a bunch of different strands. And one of them is about, right, well, the vocal tract shape can be quite different between individuals. How do we quantify that? And I use a technique called geometric morphometrics to do that. And that was introduced in evolutionary biology. And the idea is it's a statistical way of comparing shapes. So the idea is you put landmarks onto a shape. So my MRI data, I'm going through individually, slice by slice. And, all right, the tongue tip is here. And the nose point is here. And then we can compare them between individuals. And we can do nice statistical things like principal component analysis in terms of shape. So we can say, right, in this population, this is a very small population of 8 speakers, 4 male, 4 female. How does vocal tract shape vary? What's the first largest component of vocal tract shape variation? And it turns out for these speakers, this is animated, but it's a bit slower than I want it to be. So I've also put the minimum and maxima here. And what you might be able to see here, it's a bit difficult, is that hard palate shape is sort of getting more and less domed, and the tongue shape is kind of following that. Yeah, it may be easier to see here, but it's a bit slow. So with that, that's telling us something about, well, tongue position and the sort of the fixed anatomy, if you like, how those are co-varying in this population. But with the second principal component, which is still accounting for nearly 20% of the shape variation, we're seeing something very different. We're seeing a kind of overall tongue position forwardly backliness. I'm currently running this on that's 8 subjects on 75 subjects. So we'll have sort of better, more generalizable conclusions. So this paper is kind of just a pilot. But hopefully what you can see here is the kind of use of this technique for actually comparing shape among a population. That's all I'm going to say about geometric morphometrics. But I'm actively researching this, and particularly for articulatory dynamics. So fingers crossed there'll be some more to talk about if you'll invite me again. So kind of overall what I'm getting to in my work is this idea that vocal tract shape is kind of a sum of a bunch of different factors. And through the landmarking analysis that I showed you just now, we can actually start to regress out different ones and see how shape changes. But really, what seems to be the case with the data that we've seen so far is that the instantaneous vocal tract shape is some kind of weighted sum of components related to the hard stuff, the thick stuff that you can't change. So your anatomy, whether you've had teeth out, things like that. Then what we call setting/style. So things like if you have a habitual, what we call vocal tract setting. So for instance, Sean Connery holds his tongue habitually quite far back in his mouth. Kermit the Frog is a good example of a raised larynx type of voice. So there are these things that sort of, there's a way of holding the vocal tract articulators. So they kind of overlay on top of anatomy. But also within this section, which might be 2 sections, I haven't quite decided, is things like is style. So for instance, if you're shouting, you can imagine your vocal tract shape is sort of globally quite different than if you're whispering. And in theory, that's something that we should be able to just plug into something like this and still account for everything else as well that's going on, because they all interact. And at this end, we have what we call articulatory strategies, so the techniques that you're using, the movements you're making to say the thing that you're trying to say. So that's going to be related, of course, to the message that you're trying to convey, but also your language, your accent. Co-articulation is where the exact articulation of one particular phoneme might change depending on what neighbouring phonemes are around it. And then this bit, which is the one I really want to quantify, and which nobody seems to be able to tell us yet, is noise. Right, if we repeat all these MRI measurements 10 times on the same subject, how variable is the vocal tract shape just not as a consequence of any of these other things. It's just there's a range of acceptable targets, and sort of how do we fall within that. All of this is TBD at the moment. I promised you an overview. One other aspect then, once we've got some idea of how to quantify shape, is we can then use simulations to sort of systematically study their effect on the acoustic signal. So this is my one promised slide for Stefan of a numerical model. This is a digital waveguide simulation. Again, the frame rate is very fast, but just because I think it conveys it better. But I'll run back to the start again. We have in theory, this is the larynx, the vocal folds down here, and this is sound propagating through and then out for an R vowel. Let's go back to the start so you can see it starting. So kind of the point I want to make here is, at least with simulation, we have a very controlled vocal tract shape, and we can systematically change the different parts of it to then study the effect on the acoustic signal. So that's one element of my research as well. At the moment, we're still in the quantifying what the directions of variation are to tell us what to study with this, but that's another angle. This keeps wanting to play. Sorry, I'm trying to skip a slide. Okay, so I just want to kind of bring this back to context then. So why does any of this even matter? Who cares? The point is that we still don't know very much about how individual vocal tracts vary. We have lots of acoustic information. We have some really good information from sort of ultrasound and electromagnetic articulography and things about how vocal tracts move. But what we don't really know is how to compare them to one another, because we don't have very much of that 3D MRI vocal tract data that I showed you at the beginning. Publicly released, I think there's about 100, or order of 100 individuals. So that's not enough data for us to make a nice statistical model that goes, oh, okay, here's an average vocal tract shape, and I can map my person-specific articulatory movements onto that and understand it better and compare them from person to person. We just don't have that kind of amount of data yet to fully understand how much this can vary. So I'm trying to fill in some gaps there with my research, because the idea is that if we knew more, we could do a whole bunch of things. And in particular, we could obtain vocal tract shape information from the speech signal alone. Now I know that this is also a data science problem, but I tend to lean towards, well, it'd be nice to have some information about the underlying system as well. And also, do things like planning oral surgery to minimize disruption to speech. If I'm going to take out the tonsils or the root of the tongue, we can then go, okay, well, that's going to change the vocal tract shape in this way, and then, how can I minimize the damage that I'm doing with that? So that's sort of long-term impacts of this kind of work. But at the moment, it's forming more sort of underpinning research for this field of forensic speaker comparison. So this is the part now where I change tack slightly and introduce to you the idea of forensic audio analysis in general, and then go in more detail into forensic speaker comparison. So, forensic audio analysis. What is it? Basically, it is a range of tasks involving audio as evidence in criminal cases, normally. So there are a range of things that are done. The most common is forensic speaker comparison, which I will come on to in more detail in a bit. But some of the other things that might be involved, and these are essentially all audio signal processing tasks, right? Things like authentication, checking, has this been edited? You want your evidence to be a true evidence of the thing that happened, but also someone might say, no, that isn't what happened. The policeman has inserted, a spoof voice or something over the top of that, and your job is to look for evidence in the audio signal as to whether or not that's happened, whether or not it was made with the device at the right time. All of these things. It might not just be about the speech content or the audio content of the signal, but there could be some more general digital forensic stuff in the metadata, things like that. And this is one of the ones where, I don't know, you promised you were going to mention it and you didn't. I did a video with Tom Scott, I don't know if anyone's seen that, on something called electrical network frequency analysis. And that is this idea that mains hum varies very slightly depending on the demand in the network. So within half a hertz, plus or minus half a hertz, I'm getting one nod, plus or minus half a hertz of 50 hertz in this country, 60 hertz in others, there's a sort of a wiggle in the mains hum frequency. And because the national grid retains that information, and because over a long enough time window it is unique, we can use that if we've got mains hum in a recording to date that recording. And also if it's missing obvious bits or dropping in and out, then that's a really good sign that it's been edited. So that's a nice use of good old signal processing techniques there. The one that my students laugh about music technology textbooks about the most is audio enhancement. So this is basically using all the techniques that you will have learned to make really nice sounding recordings, to take a really horrible sounding recording and try to identify the evidential content in it. Now forensic recordings they're really bad. I really wanted to play you some, but there's GDPR issues with sharing the casework and I can't. But imagine it's a covert recorder in a policeman's armpit under here and he's behind a tree and the people are 20 meters over there. And they're going, okay, can you enhance this and get us the evidence, the speech evidence out of this? So we're applying a range of filters and sort of different, really music processing type techniques to try and get the evidential content in the recording, which might be speech or it might be, a gunshot or something in the background. But we're trying to clean it up with exactly the same tools that everyone else is using to do nice music production work with. And the textbooks that exist about this are mostly for nice music production. And so all my students are always like, what? They're, nicely improving the SNR to these values that are completely ridiculous. And I'm like, no, in normal audio, that's not ridiculous at all. But in forensic audio, it really is. So those are kind of the two main ones aside from forensic speaker comparison. But some of the other stuff that forensic audio analysts do include transcription. But particularly disputed utterance transcription. So where there has a recording, and you can kind of hear it one of two ways. It's like the Laurel and Yanny thing. And the policeman saying, oh, they're saying this, and clearly that implicates them in the crime. And the suspect is saying, no, I didn't say that, I said this instead. So then you would do a kind of phonetic acoustic analysis on that and go actually on the basis of the content in the spectrogram, we think this is more likely to be the one utterance or the other. Reconstruction happens from time to time, so that's reconstructing an acoustic scene and sort of testing the properties of the recording devices. So one of the main ways that this can happen is if someone's made a 999 call and there appears to be some evidence in the background. You sometimes would need to go and test if going and making a call in that exact situation and being like, can that be picked up or has that been somehow, is that unlikely to have happened? So yeah. There's an unlimited number of different reconstruction tasks that could happen, but those are just some examples. But yeah, so I would say it's around 70%, over 70% of forensic audio analysis that happens in this country at least is forensic speaker comparison. So that's kind of where the voice comes back in. So the process itself is the question of, given two recordings, so I have, for instance, my policeman's armpit recording behind the plant, and I have a recording of a police interview with the suspect. Are they the same speaker? Actually, now that I say it, that's a bad example because the policeman behind the plant could probably see who it was. But okay, let's imagine that we had a bug in a car. So a covert recording device in a car. There are 4 people in the car, and we want to know which person it was, for instance, and we've got police interviews with all 4 of them. So this is a slightly different problem to speaker verification. I ring up my bank and I say my voice is my password, because there you've got a closed set and you might well have sort of limited domain, you might have only specific words. In this case, essentially what we're doing is we're comparing a suspect against all the other people in the world and providing an evidence value for whether we think it's them or not. So there are 2 really important things we need to know about that. First of all, we need to know how similar the 2 voices are. Okay, so you could think, this person speaks with an Australian accent and that person speaks an Australian accent. And if we don't also include how typical the voices are, then we might conclude that those 2 are the same speaker. But if we're in Australia, for instance, that's not a very good measure of speaker similarity. So we need to have both how really are. And there are lots of issues wrapped up in this, in that you have to decide you have to decide on a population within which to judge typicality. So if you know something about the voice of your suspect, and he's a Edinburgh Scottish speaker from Edinburgh, for instance, you would have to get a population of people who are the same age-ish and gender-ish, and also record them in the same channel conditions that the recordings were made in. And, you know, is Edinburgh Scottish specific enough, or is it too specific? You know, it depends on the details of the case. So almost always the situation here is that unless there is data conveniently available that's recorded in exactly the right channel conditions from your case, you as a forensic audio analyst then have to go out and find 20, 30, 100 people that match and form your relevant population. So you can imagine that might cause a bit of an issue. So as human analysts, what we would tend to do is use our knowledge of a particular dialect region and say, right, well, actually, I think that's quite atypical. But when you're training a machine system, which we'll talk about in a minute, you literally have to go out and get that data. So that can be a real problem. In this situation, we will probably have to deal with different recording conditions. So even if our police interview wasn't recorded in a really resonant police interview room onto a rubbish system or something, still probably the evidential recording would be at least telephone bandwidth or maybe muffled or something. So the two conditions are very likely to be mismatched. So that can be a problem. A speaker sounds different just throughout the day, but also, you know, depending on what they've eaten or whether they've got a cold or all of these things. Inherently, speakers are very, very variable. This is not like DNA evidence where your DNA stays the same, right? Your voice changes all the time. Also, your voice probably will be, just your speaking style will probably be quite different in a police interview to when you're doing a crime. So those two recordings are going to be potentially different as well. And then there's also all the nuisance recording conditions, background noise, other speakers getting on your recordings and in the way. So these are all kind of technical problems that we need to deal with. Very importantly, in real forensic data, we never actually have a ground truth, right? We have the outcome of the court case and we assume, unless there's been a miscarriage of justice, that the person who was accused is the person who did it, but we don't actually know that ever. So we do need ways of validating this, given that we actually don't have a ground truth. So with automatic systems, again, which I'll talk about in a moment, you can test them on data sets where you know, this is this person, and check. With human raters, that is just more difficult. It's very difficult to ask them to do hundreds of thousands of comparisons and get an error rate as a system for a person. But at the moment, that is what the majority of forensic speaker evidence is in the UK. So that is something that is in the process of changing, but for a variety of reasons which I'll come on to, we can't use fully automatic systems in the UK at the moment. So yeah, there's pressure from the government for fully validated systems, but at the end of the day, there's a human in the loop, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So how is this task done? There are two main approaches, and as I say, in the UK, we're only in this column, and I'll explain why in a moment. But really, ideally, what we want is a sort of combined approach, because they're getting at different things. So with an auditory acoustic approach, we call it, you have a human expert who's trained through their education, right, which we hope is reliable enough. And they're going to look at things that they know are very speaker discriminatory. So for instance, we talked about how S's before might say something about the shape of the alveolar ridge, right? So they're looking for things like that where they know there's definitely information there. One of those things is hesitation markers, things like people do them unconsciously. So even if they're putting on a voice disguise, they tend not to, not to disguise the hesitation marker. And also they're quite variable between individuals. So that's something that a forensic human expert might hone in on. And then in all reputable forensic audio professionals will not be presenting any evidence to try as a fact without it being cross-checked by at least one other expert. With an automatic approach, it it takes the whole audio signal and it's going to do some feature extraction across the whole thing. Typically, with the systems that we use in forensics, they're MFCCs. So they're mostly features that relate to the filter rather than the source characteristics of the voice. And they're trained on large data sets, and we can validate them sort of mathematically using known corpora of same and different speakers and get sort of error rates and numerical quantifications of how good they are. And then we are going to present this evidence to triers of fact. Most of the time, it's not a jury. It very rarely ends up going all the way to trial before jury, but it can be. And what's really important is this evidence is understandable and clear to a lay audience. So the reason ASR evidence is not currently acceptable in UK courts is because in a 2015 case, someone tried to use it, and it set a precedent that they think it's a black box, they don't know what it's doing, so we don't want to use that. So before long, someone will come along and make a reasonable case and show a good explanation that actually automatic speaker recognition, in addition to a human expert, is a good thing to use. But at the moment, because it wasn't explainable to a lay audience, the precedent is you can't use it in UK courts. In Europe and other parts of the world, it is being used. But again, the ideal way for it to be used is in addition to human expert. The other thing, so anyone who works in sort of more in the informatics-y side of this university might be surprised that we're still using MFCCs as our feature for this. The point with a forensic expert witness type stuff is we're presenting it to a court and it needs to be a really, really, really well-validated system, right? They will not accept the state-of-the-art, newfangled, I can't think of a single example now, but beautiful AI type model that has been shown in experiments to have really good performance if it hasn't been validated and validated and validated. So the forensic speaker comparison algorithms are a bit behind the curve in terms of a lot of really cutting-edge speech technology research. And then finally, the really important point is that evidence, and this is all forensic evidence, is presented within a Bayesian framework. So Bayesian statistics, sort of as versus frequentist statistics, which is your p-values that you might be used to from school. The frequentist approach is, right, how probable is this data given the hypothesis that we have? So we're kind of starting out already with a hypothesis as our as our prior, if you like. But in a Bayesian framework, we're testing how probable is our hypothesis given this data, which hopefully even just wording it like that, you can see is probably a better way to be treating evidence. But what it also allows us to do is calculate the likelihood ratio for a particular piece of evidence. So once we've got our information about how similar are these voices within to each other and how typical are they within a population, we can create what's called a likelihood ratio. And that's describing the strength of a piece of evidence. And the point is that the judge and jury get all these different evidences in different likelihood ratio form, and they can kind of assimilate them, into a conclusion. So there is a mathematical framework for doing so. And when you present your findings in court, you therefore have to err on this very lovely wordy thing that says the findings represent moderately strong support for the proposition that the question voice is the person of interest rather than that of an unknown person recorded in similar acoustic conditions. So that's kind of how evidence of this type is delivered in court. It's very kind of sort of hedgy and very, very Bayesian, if you're familiar with that kind of stuff. But that's just a point I wanted to make. So that's the process of forensic speaker comparison. And as you might imagine, there's lots and lots of research to be done. And the big one at the moment, particularly in the last month or so, where it's really kicking off, is spoofing and deepfake detection. So suddenly the public is aware that there are really good voice clone technologies available on the internet. And you might have seen, I mean, that how I broke into a bank account with an AI-generated Vice article is just from a couple of weeks ago. This is going to be coming up in court. As far as we know, it has not come up as a defense yet. Actually, it wasn't me, it was on the recording, it's a spoof of me. But, I mean, people are aware of it now, it's definitely going to happen. So that is a massive, massive area of interest. And from outside forensics as well, from more like voice biometric type applications. We've talked about the relevant population, so I will gloss over that because I'm aware of the time. And Yeah, so then also, as I mentioned towards the beginning, we don't really have a proper understanding of this link between the acoustic signal and the shape of the vocal tract that's making it. But what we do know from these forensic systems is that MFCC features, which theoretically encode vocal tract shape and not so much source information, we know that they perform really well for a speaker identification task. So in the quest for explaining what our systems are doing towards the jury, what we actually really need is a mapping to say, oh, these features they come from the vocal tract in this way. So that's kind of the part of this that I'm hoping to contribute to. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is we need more researchers looking particularly at spoofing and deepfake detection, but sort of all of this. So please, if you are interested at all, anyone looking for a job in forensic audio, please do come and chat to me because I think it's really cool. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say, just to summarise. So we can describe the acoustics of the voice pretty well, actually, by considering source and filter as independent things. And individuals vary very, very wildly in terms of source and filter characteristics, and those can be due to both biological and behavioural differences. So we can leverage those differences for forensic speaker comparison. Forensic audio analysis in general includes a bunch of other tasks, but I think things that are probably pretty familiar to this audience. They are your classic audio processing tasks, just applied in a different way. And yeah, forensic audio analysis is one of these things that has sort of unique and interesting challenges, new ways to think about things, I think, and that's why I like it. You know, things around presenting evidence to lay people. I think that's a really, you know, for me, this was something I didn't know about a few years ago, and now that I'm learning more about it, I really like it as a new way of thinking about audio. So I'm going to leave it there. Apologies for going slightly over. That's my thank you slide. And if anyone is interested in this, I know I was told to sell it, so I'm selling it. There's some further books here on forensic audio analysis in general. Thank you very much. Oh, the question cube. Who's ready? I'm not going to throw it. I do just want to try it out because I think it's really exciting. I've never seen one of these before.
Okay. That was a great talk. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was going to ask about voice spoofing and voice identification. Would you say there's a bit of an arms race kind of between the two technologies?
Yes.
And if there is, then who's currently winning?
Who's currently winning?
Yeah.
Spoofers.
Okay.
Yeah. But well, I don't know if that's fair. What I will say is new algorithms have suddenly come out in the last sort of couple of months that have got real media traction. So things like Valley from Microsoft and 11 Labs, they've put out these algorithms. Some are more or less accessible. So Tachytron is Google's one, and Valley is Microsoft's one. They are behind Google and Microsoft walls, right? But some of them can be used publicly, are being used publicly by trolls on 4chan and things. And the issue with their detection is that they're all different systems. So actually, a one-size-fits-all detector is, at least at this stage, probably quite unrealistic. So every time there's a new algorithm, there will be something about it that's detectable, but it's a new and a different thing. So I think that's kind of where we're at the moment is, I think, yeah, it's a big area that's got lots of interest, and so people are doing lots of different things. And at the moment, it does feel a bit like some of the detection side of things is on catch-up. There are big challenges every couple of years. Is the ASV Spoof Challenge, and they work on spoofing detection and countermeasures. And that, you know, has been going since, I think, 2015, 2017. This work is constantly being done, but it just feels like suddenly there's a bit of a threshold in terms of interest in this, I guess. And so I think it's just going to become a bigger and bigger problem.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sorry, got the question cube first.
When you talk about studying the relationship between vocal tract shape and MFCCs, so more, I mean, probably more variation of the vocal tract. So what level of details you are aiming
as much as possible. So it's a data problem, really. And so what we want, ideally, is loads and loads and loads of dynamic 3D vocal tract information, and then we can map them frame by frame to MFCCs. We'll have to account for the fact that MFCCs vary with other stuff that's not related to the vocal tract, you know, channel conditions and things, they're all encoded in there. But yes, theoretically, the idea is that they are encoding the vocal tract shape somehow. We're definitely not there yet, even in terms of dynamic 3D. MRI is not a thing that's widely available. So we're hoping to approximate that using the mid-sagittal 2D MRI, and because of the geometric morphometric techniques, which I didn't go into too much detail in, we can, you know, regress out these different characteristics, and we can correlate them with basically other things like MFCC. So what we're looking for there is correlations between, vocal tract shape as one number and MFCCs as another. There is a slight problem there in that actually the principal component of vocal tract variation is size. And when we do the shape comparisons, we normalize out size. So therefore, it's very difficult to compare to MFCCs, which naturally encode vocal tract size. So there's some intermediate steps to be worked out there. But yes, basically, I think it's going to depend on the data, in answer to your question, but I have aspirations.
What kind of data do you have, actually? So you say like 2D Cine MRI?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So up until fairly recently, it's been a frame rate issue, and the MRI is just not capable of capturing frames fast enough to sort of represent how fast speech varies. But now we're at a stage where you can get information on a short enough time scale to start to map it to spectral characteristics at sort of around the 25 millisecond frame level. So yeah, that's kind of an area of ongoing research, but we've sort of, I think, now reached the threshold with real-time MRI that can be done. So that's kind of where that's going, I think. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I got a bit rambly in the middle. Thank you.
Could you envisage putting a suspect in an MRI machine?
So police forces already won't pay for you to go out and record a relevant population. Probably that's outside their budget. So I would have thought not. But then, yeah, you do. In theory, if we get to the stage where you can obtain information about vocal tract shape from the audio signal, there's probably other things that correlate with vocal tract shape, like size and weight and things, that might help with speaker profiling or suspect profiling. But there are also some ethical issues around that, so that's all kind of potentially maybe one day in the future type research. You had a question.
Kind of in the same vein with the AI, I don't try and say it succinctly, but I'm just kind of curious, because you said, yes, the AI has gotten, certain algorithms have gotten a lot of media traction, but I'm curious kind of what the developments have been like and how they've impacted the research that you're doing and looking at kind of in the years leading up to kind of the kind of recent surge in interest in AI and kind of public-facing AI.
So we did a study in, I want to say it was 2020, where we were looking at perception of spoofed speech just by lay listeners, and we found that for most of the spoofing algorithms that were available at the time, they didn't convince people, and so it wasn't really a problem necessarily. I think now having a better understanding of what the mechanism behind natural speech is will help, probably with spoofing detection type stuff. But I'm not quite sure how yet, because as I say, they're all slightly different. And the interesting thing, I guess, about that is that a lot of things like speaker detection systems and speaker identity systems are built using the same features and frameworks as the spoofing systems, right? So if we can then find... So yeah, it's literally an arms race in that they're using this. It's almost like a adversarial network situation where I'm getting better at doing this, but I'm getting better at detecting it on the basis of the same thing. So I think probably there's going to need to be like a wider search of different things, features, techniques that you could use to detect spoofing. But also I think there's going to start to be more of a, like, I heard it described the other day as audio watermarking. I don't know how that would happen, but I think as people become more and more aware of spoofing as an option, it's going to become more ways of sort of verifying that this isn't spoof data. But that, again, is very much in the conceptual stage, I think, at the moment. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's just interesting, yeah.
Thanks. So it seems like that, you know, for your work to stand up in court, it has to be watertight, you know, of very high certainty to be useful. Whereas for a spoof to be successful, it just has to be relatively plausible.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different cases, and in the ASV spoof challenge they call it, so a logical access situation is where you've got a spoofed voice that's trying to access like a bank account, right? So that has a threshold of goodness that it has to pass. But then there's also the deepfake scenario where it's not trying to pass any test. It's just kind of going out there and being like, oh, so a recent example was someone did Emma Watson's voice reading Mein Kampf on 4chan, right? And people believed it enough. It was convincing enough. And there wasn't like a specific test that it was trying to pass. So yeah, I think there's the two different angles, and I think the logical access one is likely to be solved first. The deepfake one is just, you know, people believe stuff, you know, and if you do something that's convincing enough, it's going to convince at least a few people.
Which is the problem.
Which is the worry.
Or this, yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Do you think that, like, explainable models, like we were just talking about, are ever, well, maybe not ever, but if they're going to catch up and be comparable to the current wave of, like, deep learning models, which are just black boxes?
Good question. I think they're always going to be slightly behind, but I think at some point there's going to be a threshold of performance anyway, and if you're a little bit behind but you're still at the top of the curve, it's probably not the end of the world. It's becoming more of a priority, certainly across all AI. So I'm hoping that maybe someone will crack it in a different AI field, and then we can just borrow it. But yeah, certainly, yeah, people are trying things, and at the moment, no one's got anything very convincing for voice, as far as I'm aware. But I think it's going to be one of these things where as little inroads start to get made, then there becomes a cumulative, and then suddenly there'll be a, hopefully, like we've seen with the spoofing, suddenly there'll be a whew, and then everything will be very explainable and wonderful. Right? Some people in this room, come on, you guys.